The summer heat beat down on the prison yard as the transport van passed through the final security checkpoint. Inside, a single man sat quietly, his wrists bound by silver handcuffs that caught the morning sunlight. His expression remained unchanged as the van's wheels crunched over the gravel, bringing him closer to his new home, Stone Ridge Maximum Security Prison. The guards had seen all types of reactions from new inmates: crying, shouting, threatening, even praying. But this one was different. The new prisoner, in his mid-40s, carried himself with an unsettling calmness. His eyes, sharp and alert, took in every detail of his surroundings as he stepped down from the van. He wasn't muscular or particularly tall, just average-looking in every way, wearing a plain white t-shirt and standard-issue orange pants. Fresh meat. Someone shouted from behind the chain-link fence where other inmates gathered for their yard time. A few whistles and taunts followed, but the new arrival didn't even flinch. Instead, he walked with measured steps, his shoulders relaxed, head held at an angle that somehow made him look both submissive and dangerously aware. The intake process was routine: fingerprints, photographs, medical check. The prison staff noted how he answered questions politely but briefly, his voice carrying a slight accent that was hard to place. When asked about his previous occupation, he simply replied, "business consultant." The classification officer snorted at that. They'd heard every euphemism in the book. What struck everyone was how he seemed to know the drill without being told. He moved through the processing stations like he'd done it 100 times before, yet his paperwork showed no prior convictions. One veteran guard whispered to another, "Something's off about this one." In the holding cell, other new arrivals huddled in corners or paced nervously. He chose a spot against the wall with clear sightlines to both the door and the small window, sitting cross-legged on the floor. His face remained neutral as he watched two younger inmates argue over space on the single bench. When the time came for assignment to cell blocks, the other new inmates shuffled forward anxiously. He waited until last, rising smoothly to his feet in one fluid motion that made the nearest guard instinctively rest his hand on his baton. There was something about the way he moved, like a cat pretending to be a mouse. Word spread quickly through the prison grapevine about the new arrival in Block D. The white supremacist gang that controlled that block was already planning their usual welcome party for the new black inmate. They watched from their cells as he was led to his assigned space, noting how he didn't seem scared or even concerned. What they didn't notice was how his eyes had already mapped every camera angle, every blind spot, and every potential weapon within reach. They missed the way he already identified the power players, the alliances, and the weak links in their operation. Most importantly, they failed to recognize that his ordinary appearance was perhaps his greatest deception. As night fell on his first day, he sat on his thin mattress, ignoring the whispered threats and racist comments from nearby cells. While other new inmates tossed and turned, wrestling with fear and regret, he remained still, his breathing steady. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth as he heard the gang members planning their approach for tomorrow. They thought they'd found an easy target. A middle-aged black man who looked soft, probably in for some white-collar crime. They had no idea that the quiet man in cell 237 had been the ghost that haunted law enforcement nightmares for over a decade. They didn't know that their little prison game was about to be interrupted by someone who'd been running cities while they were fighting over cigarettes and commissary items. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, the first hints that they'd made a terrible mistake. The morning routine started with the harsh buzz of the cell doors. The new inmate was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed as if he'd been expecting it. Around him, the prison came to life with the usual mix of grumbling voices and shuffling feet. Breakfast in the mess hall was where it began. As he walked through the food line, holding his metal tray, he could feel the eyes following him. A group of heavily tattooed men sat at what was clearly their claimed table, making no effort to hide their stares. Their leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a scar running down his neck, nodded slightly to one of his followers. "Hey, old-timer," called out one of the gang members, stepping into the new inmate's path. "That's our table you're heading to." The new arrival hadn't even been walking in that direction, but that didn't matter. This was about establishing dominance. The new inmate paused, his face showing no emotion. "My mistake," he said quietly, his voice carrying an odd mix of respect and something else. Something that made a few of the younger gang members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Throughout the morning, the harassment continued. In the yard, someone knocked his book out of his hands. During work detail in a laundry room, his assigned cart mysteriously disappeared, forcing him to explain to the supervisor why he wasn't working. At every turn, the gang made their presence felt. But something was off. Each time they pushed, the new inmate's reactions weren't what they expected. He'd step aside with a slight bow of his head, but his movements were too smooth, too controlled. When they surrounded him near the weight pile, trying to intimidate him with their numbers, he positioned himself so subtly that he was never fully encircled, always maintaining a clear escape route. During afternoon yard time, the gang decided to escalate. 3 of them approached while he was doing pull-ups. "Time for your payment, new fish," the largest one growled. "Everyone here pays protection, and you're past too." The new inmate lowered himself from the bar, turning to face them with that same unsettling calm. Up close, they noticed things they'd missed before. Faded scars on his knuckles, a slight hardness in his eyes that didn't match his submissive posture. "I appreciate the offer of protection," he said softly, "but I prefer to handle my own security." The words were polite, but something in his tone made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. It wasn't fear in his voice, it was patience, the kind a parent might show to a child throwing a tantrum. One of the younger gang members made the mistake of reaching for the new inmate's shirt. What happened next was so quick that nearby observers would later disagree on the details. The new inmate seemed to simply shift his weight, but somehow the younger man ended up stumbling backward, his own momentum used against him so smoothly it looked like he'd just tripped on his own feet. "My fault," the new inmate said, helping the embarrassed young man up with a grip that was just a little too firm. "These prison shoes have no traction." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Back in their cell block, the gang leader watched the security footage someone had smuggled from the guard station. He replayed the yard incident several times, his face growing more serious with each viewing. Something about the new inmate's movement pattern seemed familiar. He'd seen something similar years ago, in a training video during his brief time in the military. That evening, as the cells were locked down for the night, whispers traveled through the prison. Someone claimed they'd seen similar moves in a documentary about special forces. Another remembered a news story from years ago about an underworld figure who'd never been caught on camera. The stories grew wilder with each telling, but one detail remained consistent. They'd all underestimated the quiet man in cell 237. As the lights dimmed, the new inmate sat on his bed, reading a worn paperback book. He didn't react to the whispers, didn't acknowledge the growing tension. He was waiting for them to make the one mistake he knew was coming. After all, some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Word spreads fast in prison, but respect spreads even faster. By the 3rd day, other inmates had started noticing small things about the new arrival that didn't quite add up. The way he moved through crowded spaces without ever brushing against anyone. How he always seemed to know when guards were approaching, even when they were doing silent checks. During lunch, an old-timer who'd been inside for 20 years watched the new inmate eat. The old man had served in Vietnam, and something about the way the new prisoner held his spoon, not like a utensil, but like it could become a weapon in a split second, brought back memories of special operations soldiers he'd encountered during the war. The gang wasn't done testing him, though. They tried cutting in front of him in the shower line, but he simply stepped aside with a slight nod, his eyes scanning each of them in a way that made them feel like they were being photographed from the inside out. When they knocked over his food tray in the mess hall, he cleaned it up without complaint, but everyone noticed how he positioned himself so no one could get behind him. "Watch his hands," one of the kitchen workers whispered to his friend. "Notice how they're always ready. My cousin was a boxer, moved just like that, always prepared to strike." The breaking point came during afternoon recreation. The gang's leader had brought in his entire crew, 12 men forming a loose circle in the weight room. The new inmate was bench pressing, his movements precise and controlled. A young gang member, eager to prove himself, decided to make his move. "Need a spotter, old man," he sneered, reaching for the bar. What happened next became prison legend. The new inmate sat up smoothly, his movements so fluid it seemed almost casual. But in that simple motion, he'd somehow positioned himself at an angle that forced the young troublemaker to step back. It wasn't aggressive. It almost looked like he was just making room on the bench. Yet somehow, the entire gang found themselves having to shuffle their positions, suddenly aware that their carefully planned circle had been broken. "Thank you for offering," the new inmate said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent weight room. "But I learned long ago to watch my own back." The words were simple, but something in his tone made two of the younger gang members take another step back. In the yard, later that day, a Hispanic inmate who'd been watching the scene unfold approached one of the gang members. "You know who that is, don't you?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "I was in the library yesterday, looking through old newspapers. Man, you guys picked the wrong person to mess with." The gang member brushed him off, but doubt had started creeping in. They'd all noticed how the guards treated the new inmate differently. Not with respect exactly, but with a kind of cautious awareness, like handling an unfamiliar explosive. During dinner, the prison imam, who'd been inside for 15 years, watched the new inmate eat alone. He remembered seeing a documentary years ago about an underground figure who'd never been photographed. Someone so skilled at staying in the shadows that police weren't even sure he existed. The way this new prisoner moved, always aware, but never obvious about it, stirred something in his memory. As the day wound down, the gang leader sat in his cell, thinking hard. His second in command had heard rumors from a guard about the new inmate's transfer papers. Apparently, they'd come with special handling instructions from 3 different federal agencies. The new inmate spent the evening as he always did, reading quietly in his cell. But tonight, more eyes were watching him. The gang members found themselves wondering about his perfect posture, his calculated movements, the way he seemed to own every space he occupied without trying to dominate it. In the darkness of his cell, the old Vietnam veteran listened to the night sounds of the prison. Something big was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he used to sense ambushes in the jungle. The new inmate wasn't just any prisoner, and soon everyone would understand why crossing him had been their biggest mistake. The prison held its breath, waiting for tomorrow, knowing that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't need to bare its teeth to prove its power. The old librarian had worked in the prison's small library for 12 years, organizing books and helping inmates with their legal research. On this particular morning, he was sorting through old newspaper archives when something caught his eye. A faded photograph that made his hands tremble. The image showed the aftermath of what the article called the biggest underground empire takedown that never happened. Law enforcement had raided multiple locations across 3 states, only to find emptied safe houses and encrypted computers. The suspected leader had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only whispered legends. Looking up from the article, the librarian watched through the library window as the new inmate walked across the yard. The way he moved, the subtle confidence in his stride, it all clicked into place. The man they'd been harassing wasn't just another prisoner. He was the ghost that had haunted law enforcement for over a decade. During lunch hour, the librarian approached the gang leader's table, his arthritis-twisted hands clutching a folder of newspaper clippings. "You need to see this," he whispered, sliding into a seat. That new guy you've been messing with, he's not what you think." The gang leader initially brushed him off, but something in the old man's frightened eyes made him take the folder. As he flipped through the pages, his face grew increasingly pale. One article detailed how an entire rival organization had disappeared overnight, not through violence, but through a series of perfectly orchestrated moves that left them bankrupt and powerless. "That's not even the worst part," the librarian continued, his voice barely audible. "Remember that big drug bust in Miami 5 years ago? The one where they found all those dealers tied up with their own product? Look at the description of the suspected mastermind. In the yard, oblivious to the revelations unfolding in the cafeteria, the new inmate was doing his usual routine of walking laps. 2 guards watched him from their post, sharing their own observations. "Something weird about that transfer paperwork," one guard muttered to his partner. "Never seen so many blacked out sections. And did you notice? 3 separate federal agencies signed off on his intake." His partner nodded slowly. "Yesterday, I saw him in the shower. Guy's got scars I've never seen before. One looked like something my uncle had from his special forces days." The afternoon brought a subtle shift in the prison's atmosphere. The gang members who had been boldly aggressive now found reasons to be elsewhere when the new inmate passed by. Their leader sat in his cell, rereading the newspaper clippings, connecting dots he wished he'd seen earlier. During recreation time, a young gang member, unaware of the morning's discoveries, decided to make one more attempt at intimidation. He squared up to the new inmate near the basketball court, puffing out his chest. "Think you're special, old man." The new inmate's response sent chills through everyone watching. He didn't move, didn't change his expression, but somehow seemed to fill the entire space with his presence. "Special," he said softly, almost kindly. "No. I'm just a businessman who learned early that the best negotiations happen quietly." The young man backed away, finally sensing what others had already realized. As evening approached, the gang leader called an urgent meeting in the prison chapel, one of the few places they could talk without being overheard. "We've got a serious problem," he told his lieutenants, spreading out the articles. "That man we've been pushing around. He once controlled everything from Boston to Miami. They say he never lost a battle because he won them all before they even began." The prison's unofficial grapevine worked overtime that night. Inmates who'd been watching from the sidelines started sharing their own observations. A former military man described combat techniques he recognized. A one-time street hustler remembered stories from his neighborhood about a shadow figure who could bring down entire organizations without firing a shot. In his cell, the new inmate continued his evening routine, reading quietly as if nothing had changed. But now, every eye that watched him saw something different, not just a calm, middle-aged prisoner, but a force of nature disguised as a man, a ghost story made flesh. The night settled over the prison like a held breath, everyone wondering what would happen now that the truth was out. Some said the gang would back down. Others whispered that they were too proud to retreat. But one thing was certain: tomorrow would bring changes, and nobody knew quite what kind. The shower room was eerily quiet that morning, steam rising in thick clouds as water echoed off the tiled walls. The new inmate had chosen his usual early time slot, when most prisoners were still in their cells. But today was different. 4 shadows moved through the steam, thinking they had the element of surprise. They didn't know he'd been aware of them since they first started following him, their footsteps giving them away like thunder before a storm. He continued washing his face, appearing completely unaware as they positioned themselves around him. "Time to settle this," the largest one growled, pulling out a makeshift weapon crafted from a sharpened toothbrush. The steam parted as he stepped forward, revealing the new inmate's calm expression, almost apologetic, like a teacher about to correct a student's mistake. What happened next was so fast that even the security cameras couldn't capture it clearly. The new inmate's movements were like water, flowing around the first attacker's thrust. Somehow, the weapon clattered to the floor, and its wielder found himself pressed against the wall, his own momentum used against him. The second attacker rushed in but slipped on the wet floor, or at least that's what it looked like to the cameras. Only those present saw how the new inmate had subtly shifted his foot, changing the water's flow pattern at just the right moment. "Please," the new inmate said softly, his voice barely carrying over the shower spray. "Let's not make this worse than it needs to be." The remaining two attackers hesitated, suddenly understanding why wild animals freeze when facing a larger predator. The first attacker tried to push away from the wall, but found himself held in place by nothing more than the precise pressure of two fingers against his shoulder, a pressure point technique that spoke of years of training. "I've spent my life dealing with people who thought violence was the answer," the new inmate continued, his voice almost gentle. "It never ends well for them." He released the first attacker, who slumped against the wall, rubbing his shoulder. A guard, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the shower room entrance. He took in the scene: 4 tough gang members looking shaken, a weapon on the floor, and the new inmate calmly returning to his shower as if nothing had happened. "Everything okay in here?" the guard asked, his hand resting on his button. "Just a misunderstanding about shower schedules," the new inmate replied pleasantly. "I believe we've sorted it out." The 4 attackers nodded quickly, eager to escape the steam-filled room that suddenly felt more like a trap than a battleground. By lunch, the story had spread through the prison like wildfire, growing with each retelling. Some said he'd taken down all 4 men without touching them. Others swore they'd seen him move faster than humanly possible. The truth was somewhere in between, but the effect was the same: respect born of fear. The gang leader, hearing the news in his cell, finally understood what the old librarian had been trying to tell them. This wasn't just about physical prowess, it was about power on a different level. The new inmate hadn't just defended himself. He controlled the entire situation from the moment they started planning it. During afternoon yard time, inmates watched as the new inmate did his usual workout routine. Now they noticed things they'd missed before: the precision of his movements, the way he never wasted energy, the constant awareness that made him seem to have eyes in the back of his head. A younger prisoner turned to the old Vietnam veteran. "How'd he do that?" "Take down 4 guys without really hurting them." The veteran shook his head slowly. "That's the scariest part, kid. He didn't fight them, he controlled them. Guys like him, they don't need to throw punches. They win before the fight even starts." As the day drew to a close, the prison buzzed with new energy. The gang members who'd pushed so hard to establish dominance now found themselves questioning everything. Their leader sat in his cell, considering his options, knowing that traditional prison politics had just been turned upside down. The new inmate spent the evening as he always did, reading quietly in his cell. But now, when guards passed by on their rounds, they nodded respectfully. Not because of what he'd done in the shower, but because of what he hadn't done: escalate a situation that could have turned deadly. Night fell over the prison, but few slept easily. Everyone knew that the shower room incident was just the beginning. The real power play was yet to come, and it would reshape the entire prison hierarchy. The question wasn't if, but when, and who would be left standing when the dust settled. The truth has a way of spreading through prison walls like water through cracks. By morning, every inmate had heard whispers about who the new prisoner really was. The stories varied, but they all pointed to one unavoidable fact: they had a living legend in their midst. In the cafeteria, a former street dealer dropped his tray when he finally remembered where he'd heard of the new inmate before. 10 years ago, his cousin had worked for a powerful crew in Philadelphia until one day, the entire operation vanished overnight. No violence, no bodies, just gone, like it never existed. It was him, the dealer whispered to his table mates, pointing with his chin toward the new inmate who sat alone, calmly eating his breakfast. "He's the one they called the Ghost. My cousin said he could make entire organizations disappear without firing a single shot." The gang leader sat in his cell, surrounded by his most trusted lieutenants. Their usual confidence had evaporated like morning dew. One of them had received a letter from his brother on the outside. Just 3 lines that made their hands shake. "That man you're messing with. He once controlled everything from the Canadian border to Florida. Even the Cardinals feared him." During yard time, inmates watched as the new prisoner did his usual workout routine. But now they understood what they were seeing. Each pull-up wasn't just exercise. It was a demonstration of perfect control. Every lap around the track showed his patience and endurance. He wasn't just working out. He was sending a message. A guard delivering mail noticed something odd. Packages and letters for several gang members had mysteriously been delayed. The new inmate had been seen talking quietly with one of the mailroom workers the day before. Nothing could be proven, but the message was clear. He could affect their lives in ways they couldn't even imagine. In the afternoon, the gang's supply of contraband cigarettes mysteriously vanished from their hiding spot. The same day, their connection in the kitchen suddenly refused to smuggle extra food to their cells. Small things, but they added up to something bigger, a noose slowly tightening. "He's not fighting us," the gang leader explained to his confused soldiers. "He's hunting us. Every connection we lose, every privilege that disappears, it's him. And the worst part, we can't prove any of it." During dinner, an older inmate who'd been inside for 30 years watched the new prisoner from across the room. "You young guys don't understand," he told the others at his table. "Men like him don't need weapons. Their mind is their weapon. Every move he makes is like a chess piece being placed on the board." The gang tried to maintain their tough image, but their swagger had disappeared. When they passed the new inmate in the corridors, they pressed themselves against the walls, avoiding eye contact. Not because he threatened them, but because they finally understood what true power looked like. A young gang member learned his sister had suddenly lost her job at a company he'd never heard of. Another discovered his mother's loan application had been mysteriously denied. Coincidences, perhaps, but no one believed in coincidences anymore. The prison staff noticed the change too. The usual tension in the air had transformed into something different, a quiet anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. The new inmate hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't thrown a single punch since the shower incident, but somehow he was rewiring the entire prison's power structure. In the library, the old librarian watched as more inmates came to read old newspaper articles, trying to piece together the full story of who they were dealing with. Each discovery made them quieter, more respectful. They read about entire criminal empires that had crumbled without a trace, about investigations that led nowhere, about a shadow figure who could break any system from the inside. As night fell, the gang leader sat alone in his cell, looking at a photo of his family. Earlier that day, he received a note, not a threat, just an address. His mother's new address, one she hadn't even moved to yet. The message was clear. The new inmate didn't need threats or violence. He already had all the power he needed. In his own cell, the new inmate read peacefully, a slight smile playing on his lips. He'd spent decades building an empire without violence, using intelligence and strategy instead of bullets. Now, he was teaching these younger men the same lesson he taught countless others. True power isn't about who can throw the hardest punch, but who can control the game without throwing any punches at all. The morning started with an unusual silence in the prison yard. The gang that had once ruled Block D was nowhere to be seen. Their usual spots at the weight bench and basketball court stood empty, like a throne waiting for its new king. Over breakfast, whispers spread about what had happened overnight. The gang's entire support system had crumbled in just a few hours. Their hidden cell phones stopped working. Their contraband supply lines dried up. Even their bank accounts on the outside had mysteriously frozen. "It's like they're being erased," one inmate muttered to another over their morning coffee. Not with violence, but with something scarier, like they're being deleted from the system itself. The gang leader paced in his cell, holding a piece of paper that had appeared under his door during the night. It contained details about every secret deal he'd made in the past 5 years, every hidden stash, every corrupt guard on his payroll. At the bottom was a simple message: time for a change. In the prison library, the old librarian watched as the new inmate browsed through books about business strategy. Sun Tzu, the librarian noted, recognizing the cover. The Art of War. The new inmate smiled slightly. The best victories, he said softly, are the ones where no battle is needed. His words carried through the quiet library like ripples in a pond. During lunch, everyone noticed how the corrupt guards who'd once helped the gang now stood straighter, more professional. Someone had shown their superiors proof of their misconduct, but offered them the chance to reform rather than face consequences. The choice had been simple. A young gang member discovered his secret stash of contraband had vanished, replaced by a note listing every phone call he'd made to his family in the past month. Not a threat, just a reminder that nothing was truly hidden from their new watchful observer. The afternoon brought more changes. The kitchen crew, once firmly under gang control, suddenly started serving equal portions to everyone. The laundry room, where deals had been made and contraband exchanged, now operated strictly by the books. He's not just taking over, the old Vietnam veteran explained to his workout group. He's rebuilding the whole system, making it work the way it's supposed to. In the yard, inmates watched as the new prisoner did his usual exercises. But now they understood. Every movement was a lesson in control, every action calculated. He wasn't just staying in shape, he was showing them a different way to handle power. The gang's second-in-command found himself thinking about a story his grandfather used to tell, about a chess master who could win games without taking a single piece, simply by controlling the board so completely that victory was inevitable. As evening approached, the gang leader called his remaining loyal members to the chapel. But instead of planning resistance, he did something unexpected. "It's over," he announced, his voice heavy with acceptance. "He hasn't threatened us once, hasn't hurt anyone. But look around. Everything we built is gone." The prison doctor noticed something strange in his evening rounds. Fewer injuries, less tension. The usual stress that filled the air had been replaced by something else. Order, but not the kind enforced by fear. During dinner, inmates watched as the new prisoner sat at what had once been the gang's table. He didn't claim it with violence or threats. He simply sat down, opened his book, and started reading. One by one, other inmates joined him, not out of fear, but out of respect. The night brought a final symbol of the change. The gang's leader walked alone to the new inmate's cell. Their conversation was brief, quiet. No threats, no violence. Just two men acknowledging a shift in power that had happened as inevitably as the changing of seasons. In his cell, the new inmate reviewed mental notes about the day's events. He'd spent decades building an empire on the outside using the same principles: intelligence over force, strategy over violence, control over chaos. Now he was teaching these lessons to a smaller kingdom, but the rules remained the same. The prison settled into its night routine, but everything had changed. The old power structure had fallen without a single punch thrown, replaced by something new. A system built on respect rather than fear, on order rather than chaos. Tomorrow would bring more changes, but for now, the silence spoke volumes about who really controlled the game. A carefully planned prison riot wasn't supposed to feel this organized. But on this particular morning, as tensions finally boiled over, there was something different in the air. The chaos had a purpose, like a storm being guided by an unseen hand. It started in the cafeteria during breakfast. A food tray clattered to the floor, then another. Shouts filled the air as inmates began pushing and shoving. Guards rushed in, but something was off. The usual troublemakers weren't in their usual spots. Instead, they were being herded, like pieces on a chessboard. The new inmate sat calmly at his table, sipping his coffee as the chaos swirled around him. Somehow, no one came near his spot. It was as if he sat in the eye of a hurricane he'd created himself. "Now you'll see," the old Vietnam veteran whispered to his cellmate. "This isn't a riot. It's a demonstration." The gang leader and his core group found themselves pushed by the crowd into the center of the cafeteria. Every exit they tried to take was blocked, not by violence, but by carefully positioned bodies. They were being funneled toward the new inmate's table. Through the shouting and chaos, the new inmate's voice carried clearly, though he barely raised it above a conversational tone. "Shall we talk about your families?" he asked the gang leader quietly. The riot seemed to pause, like a movie put on hold. The gang leader's face went pale as the new inmate began speaking, softly, almost kindly, but each word carried the weight of absolute truth. "Your mother's new job interview tomorrow at 9 a.m., he said to one lieutenant. "Your sister's college application," to another. "Your daughter's dance recital next week," to a third. Each personal detail hit like a physical blow, showing just how deep his knowledge went. But it wasn't just threats. With each revelation came an offer, a chance to be part of something different, something better. "Your brother needs medical treatment," he told the gang leader. "I can make that happen. Legally, but things need to change." The riot continued around them, but it was background noise now. Guards stood back, somehow understanding that something important was happening. The new inmate never raised his voice, never made a threatening move. He just talked, sharing information that should have been impossible for him to know. "Your son wants to go to college," he told one of the younger gang members. "There are legitimate scholarships available. I can show you how to help him apply." The young man's tough expression cracked, revealing the father beneath. One by one, he addressed each core member of the old power structure. But instead of threatening their families, he offered paths to help them. Real opportunities, legitimate ways to make their lives better. His knowledge of their personal lives wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool for change. The gang leader stood silent, understanding finally hitting him. Every move over the past week, every small change and lost connection, had led to this moment. The riot wasn't chaos, it was orchestration, designed to create this conversation. "Your power came from fear," the new inmate said, his voice carrying despite the noise. "Fear is temporary. Real power comes from giving people a better option." As if on cue, the riot began to calm. Inmates returned to their seats, guards resumed their positions. But everyone knew the prison would never be the same. The old order had been completely dismantled, not through violence or threats, but through something more powerful, hope. The gang leader looked at his men, saw the change in their eyes. Fighting wasn't an option, not when their opponent could offer their families better lives than crime ever could. One by one, they nodded, accepting the new reality. The new inmate stood slowly, his presence filling the cafeteria. "Your families don't deserve to suffer for your mistakes," he said. "Help me build something better here, and I'll help them build something better out there." As the dust settled, inmates returned to their routines. But the air had changed. The gang that had ruled through fear now stood at a crossroads, continue their old ways and watch their families struggle, or accept the offered hand and help create something new. In his cell that night, the new inmate made notes in a small book. Outside these walls, he built an empire by understanding that every person had two pressure points, what they feared to lose and what they hoped to gain. Now he was using that same knowledge to reshape this small corner of the world. The prison fell quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the tense silence of suppressed violence, but the peaceful quiet of a place where hope had finally found a foothold. 2 months had passed since the cafeteria showdown, and the prison had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The morning sun streamed through barred windows, illuminating a very different world inside these concrete walls. The former gang leader now ran a legitimate inmate education program, teaching business skills he'd learned from his new mentor. His once violent lieutenants had become organizers of prison sports leagues and study groups. The change wasn't just on the surface, it ran deep, like roots taking hold in fertile soil. "It's like watching a masterclass in human nature," the old librarian commented to the prison chaplain. They observed as the new inmate conducted his morning routine, now joined by a group of inmates who'd once been bitter enemies. He didn't just change the power structure, he changed the people. The prison guards noticed it too. Contraband seizures had dropped to almost zero. Violence had become rare. Even the atmosphere in the cell blocks had shifted from simmering tension to something almost peaceful. One veteran guard shook his head in amazement during his morning rounds. 20 years on the job, he said to his partner, and I've never seen anything like it. These guys aren't just behaving, they're building something. In the yard, the former gang members now organized chess tournaments instead of fights. The new inmate had taught them that strategic thinking was more valuable than brute force. Every move on the chessboard was a lesson in patience, planning, and consequences. The prison's education center, once nearly empty, now had a waiting list. Former rivals sat together, learning about business management, legal studies, and computer skills. The new inmate had somehow arranged for legitimate online courses to be made available, giving men real hope for life after release. "He's not just teaching us how to survive in here," one former troublemaker explained during a study session. "He's showing us how to live out there." Even the prison administration had noticed the change. Reports to headquarters showed significant improvements in every measurable category: fewer incidents, better behavior, increased participation in rehabilitation programs. But the numbers couldn't capture the real transformation. During lunch, the cafeteria that had once been divided by racial and gang lines now showed a different picture. Men sat where they chose, talked with who they wanted. The invisible barriers that had separated them had dissolved, replaced by a shared purpose. The new inmate sat at his usual spot, reading while he ate. But now others understood. His presence wasn't just about power. It was about possibility. Every so often, someone would approach him with a question about their family, their future, their plans. He always had time to listen, to offer guidance. In the afternoon, a group gathered in the library for what they called strategy sessions. The new inmate would share stories from his past, carefully edited but filled with lessons. He taught them about business, about human nature, about the power of patience and planning. "Violence," he told them, "is what people use when they can't see a better way. I'm showing you the better way." As evening approached, the prison hummed with productive activity. Study groups met in corners, mentor sessions took place in the yard, and men who'd once solved problems with their fists now debated solutions with their minds. The former gang leader sat in his cell, looking at a letter from his mother. She wrote about how proud she was of his change, how his son was doing better in school now that Dad was setting a different example. He wasn't the only one. Dozens of families were feeling the ripple effects of the prison's transformation. In his own cell, the new inmate made his final notes for the day. His plan had worked perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. Soon, questions would start being asked about how one man had accomplished so much from inside prison walls. But that was all part of the larger strategy. He smiled slightly as he closed his notebook. The prison had been a test run, a proof of concept. If he could transform a maximum security prison using nothing but knowledge and strategy, imagine what he could do with the whole system. Perhaps his capture hadn't been an accident after all. As night fell over the prison, the atmosphere was different from 2 months ago. The air of violence and fear had been replaced by something else: hope, purpose, possibility. The new inmate lay on his bunk, listening to the sounds of men discussing their futures instead of plotting revenge. He'd built an empire on the outside by understanding human nature. Now he was building something different, something that might last longer than any empire. Because in the end, true power wasn't about controlling people through fear. It was about showing them a better way to live.